Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. In case you missed it, this meeting or this call is being recorded, and there is a closed captioning transcript that is being generated. I want to thank you all for being in the virtual realm with us today for this Controversy at Noon panel with the Writers Guild of Alberta and in partnership with the Rosé Foundation. I'd like to start our proceedings here today with an acknowledgement of the land that I am joining you from. You may be joining from different lands, so if you are, feel free to share those in the chat. Oki, Natanaku, Malvi-X, Ginlutudu, Moginstis, in the language of the Blackfoot people. I said, hello, my name is Melvi, and I am from Calgary. Calgary, or Moginstis in the language of the Blackfoot or the Siksikapi, has been home to Indigenous people from time immemorial. We have a duty as anyone who is not Indigenous to these lands to continue to work on our relationship with each other and with the land that we are on, and the Indigenous communities who have held and kept this land steady for from time immemorial. So I am joining you today from Treaty 7 land, which is the home of the people of the Blackfoot Confederacy, which includes the Gaina, the Siksika, and I'm forgetting.
Kainai.
Thank you. It was there. Thank you, Richard. And also the people of the Tsuut'ina Nation. And we are also home to the people of the Stoney Dakota Nation, and also the Métis region. Now, there has been a change in the configuration of the lands with the Métis governance, and so I don't believe we're Region 3 anymore, and I will need to update my own knowledge and understanding to reflect that, but we're also home to the Métis Nation and other Indigenous people who are here on these lands as well. So for those of you who don't know me at all, my name is Melvi-X. I am a spoken word poet, a burlesque dancer, and a visual artist. I've been based in Calgary for the last 8 years. I'm also the CEO of MVX Studios, a studio which is dedicated to empowered artistic expression, also based here in Calgary. And I am so thrilled to be hosting this panel today. So I'd like to do a little bit of an introduction of the topic, and then I didn't throw it to the panelists before, but I would really love to have all of you introduce yourselves. I feel like I could just read off your bios, but I don't feel like that gives off the same energy and welcoming as you all getting to introduce yourselves. So after I give just some brief opening remarks, I'll get all of the panelists to introduce yourselves and perhaps some of your own opening remarks on the subject. So while we're here today gathered, and I do want to give a content warning for the discussion of individuals who have perpetuated sexual and other forms of violent crimes. Please take care of yourself as needed during our panel discussion. For everyone who's joining, you don't have to put on your camera or feel like you have to be engaged more than your presence. I know sometimes that can be a thing where people feel really pressured to engage in a very particular way, and I want to really challenge that you simply being here is a form of your presence, and we appreciate that. So one of the things I kind of wanted to touch on is I'll start from the start. Harvey Weinstein was once regarded as a Hollywood wonderkind or genius. He worked with some of the most well-regarded celebrities of our time. That changed overnight with the Me Too movement and Rose McGowan bravely speaking out against Weinstein and the abuses he perpetuated against her. Weinstein is one name among many. Others come to mind, such as Chris Brown, Louis C.K., Kanye West, and more recently, Justin Roiland, who is the creator of Rick and Morty and was charged with felony domestic violence. A bit closer to home for us literary folks, J.K. Rowling is currently embroiled in a lawsuit for cyberbullying over inflammatory remarks she and others made about Algerian boxer Imane Khalif. Rowling has been in the hot seat for a few years now for arguably transphobic remarks she's made over social media, with diehard Harry Potter fans questioning the ethics of continuing to purchase Harry Potter merchandise, knowing that Rowling and her estate will be enriched. Non-binary and trans Harry Potter or former fans have been particularly vocal about their concerns, with some refusing to support any sort of Harry Potter merchandise to put political pressure on other fans to cease supporting the Rowling estate until she ceases making inflammatory remarks. My own experience, I've really struggled with the legacy of Charles Bukowski. He was my kind of gateway into poetry as a young, angsty teenager. But I learned later in life his penchant for abusing his partners and sexually assaulting others. And yet, I cannot fully bring myself to throw out his books from my collection. I refuse to buy anything brand new, as that would enrich his estate. But I often wonder to myself if this compromise is more to assuage my own guilt than a meaningful moral statement. So I don't want to talk too much more. I really would love to hear from our panelists today. I think I'll just kind of go in like the little Zoom order. So if you can please introduce yourself, and my apologies, my pronouns are she, her. So if I can get each panelist to introduce yourself and give me your opening remarks on the subject as you are comfortable. So I'll start with Moni, as she is right above me on the Zoom screen. Moni, you can take it away.
Thanks, Melody. I appreciate that. So my name is Moni, and my pronouns are she and her. I was born in India, but have spent a considerable part of my life dividing my time between Mohkinstsis and the land of the Salish Nation in the Okanagan. I feel incredibly privileged to be able to live and benefit from living on these lands. And in terms of introductory remarks, I feel deeply conflicted. I'm fascinated by the dialogue and discourse that has come up in recent years, and more recently this year on the Canadian literary landscape. Personally, I have a very difficult time separating the art from the artist, and I think that's a reflection of my own practice, where I feel my art is part of me. So I have a difficult time making that distinction between the two. I'm also very curious about how accountability plays into it, how we can flex our muscles in terms of holding someone accountable for how they show up in the world in relation to their art. And I'll just stop there. Thanks, Melby.
Thank you so much, Moni, for introducing yourself and your opening remarks. I will pass it over to Richard, who is to my right and above.
Thank you, Melby, and thank you for that right into it now introduction. We're right into the complexity of all this. My name is Richard Harrison. I'm a poet, and I live here in Calgary, and pronouns he, him. But let's get right into the argument. I think it's very complicated. I mean, it's not saying anything new to say that it's very complicated. And certainly we're in a position now where knowledge about the author has affected the way in which we consider the work. It hasn't always been that way with artists and the public. It is, in many ways, the product of the way in which writing is is created and produced and consumed and owned in this particular culture, that the author and him herself themselves have become a feature or factor in the way in which we consider their art. No one asks what kind of a person Homer was, nor would the Greeks in their own time, because they didn't see art as an expression of anyone's individuality, whereas we now do, as a result of the sort of emphasis on individuality, individual accountability, individual responsibility, individual self-determination that our culture has particularly emphasized, and again sold to us as part of the package that we buy when we buy any particular work. I'll circle back to that. I started my thinking on this with a very simple distinction. Can you separate the artist from the art? And my answer was, well, it depends on who you are. The ideal of that separation, I think, gets expressed in Roland Barthes' essay, The Death of the Author, in which he argues completely against any of this identity by saying that the reader, if we are going to make the reading of the work and the meaning making of the work important to the reader, then the author has to absent themselves, or we have to absent any kind of connection with the author in order for the reader to truly enjoy or appreciate or understand or make their own meaning out of the work. And I think of the times that I go, and I know we all do, go to classrooms where students, we present our poetry or our stories, our performances to students. And there's always a case that some student who's been taught in the sort of new critical way in which we still think about art as to say, what does this line mean? Oh, look, I have the author right in front of me. I'm going to ask them and they will tell me. Right? So that the work itself is seen as a kind of singular message that they are trying to decode. And the answer, of course, is in the back of the book or in the teacher's head. So a student will put up their hand and say, well, what does this mean? Because they got me there. And I'll say, well, I don't know. It means what you mean it. You make your meaning from it. And the student smirks. And the teacher goes, oh, why did you do that? I do it because I'm not there to decode my poetry into a series of prose messages. It's, that are maybe what I believe or what I don't believe, but it's what the character has to say or what the poem needs to say. It's up to the person to make their own meaning. On the other hand, I teach creative writing and I teach writing workshops and I mentor writers. And for the writer, there's a pure connection, like Moni said, of self and art. You have to pour yourself into your art. Your art has to be open and transparent to who you are in order for you to produce the best art that you can produce. So on one level, the answer is yes, the separation is there and it should be, in this ideal sense, total, so that the reader can enjoy the work for the work's own sake. For the writer, it should be you open yourself up completely to find the expression of who you are in the work. I'll leave it there.
Well, that leaves me. Hello. Thank you, Melvi, for that provocative introduction and for everyone's comments so far. My name is ML Martin. My pronouns they, she. I'm most of the time based in Edmonton, but I'm actually currently living in Fayetteville, Arkansas at the moment, which is where I am right now. And I'm an interdisciplinary poet and translator. And so right off the bat, I can say in a general way that issues of separating the writer, the poet from their work instantly becomes a more complicated question in the context of translation and the task of the translator, if you will. I'm also teaching a class on docu-poetics right now. So I'm interested in, and we've been interrogating this idea that you just touched on, Richard, the idea of essentially the legacy of the Romantics and the concept of individual genius and how dominant that idea has been, and the way that our literary culture in the English speaking world really has been dominated by that way of thinking about the creative force behind works of art. In that class, we are sort of interrogating some of those ideas with an effort to bring other materials into the work from the outside world that don't come from necessarily the poet's mind, that weren't delivered directly from the muse. We're retraining ourselves to look at materials from outside the poet as suitable materials for the poem. So we're operating against this idea of individual genius in that way. But I also think it's interesting in terms of this ethical question of can we separate the two things? You bring up Roland Barthes and the death of the author. And I'm also compelled, as you were speaking, Mel V, to think about the concept of authorial intent and how new criticism has trained us to say, oh no, you don't guess what the author was trying to do in this work. You just have to judge what's right here in the frame, just this frame right here of the work, the poem or the story. Don't look at the life. Don't look at other writings per se. Just judge what's right here in front of us. And while there are merits to that way of thinking in terms of criticism and appraising the value of a work, which if we take at face value that it should stand on its own, that's certainly a valuable thing to do. Of course, in the advent of some of the things that you were bringing up, Mel V, it's not so simple to keep them separate, obviously. And I'm also, I keep coming back to this idea of different contexts and each case having its own somewhat unique set of problems, and the overlapping of, what we've said so far, having to interrogate our own relationship as readers with a work. And then the separate issue, I think, of the ethical questions of whether or not to support financially the artist who has done bad things, let's say, to simplify it. They seem like separate and both, ethically weighted questions to me. One has to do with our participation in a capitalist society and the degree to which we want to essentially weaponize whatever little capitalist power we have to punish this bad doer, and takes to take justice into our hands a little bit and say, no, I'm not going to support that person. That seems like perfectly reasonable stance to me. And I also, I would never take away anyone's prerogative to say, I'm never going to go to a movie made by this person again, or I'm never going to read a book by this person again. That question to me has both political and also ethical and sometimes very personal reasons behind it, and I think that it's important to honor the individual reader or audience members' choices around that. But I think the thornier question has to do with the attitudes that we take towards our own readership and the relationship that we have to works. And we can't necessarily say, oh, I have a relationship to this work, but not this author. Well, that's the mind that made this work, And I think part of the issue comes into play sometimes where I'll put myself first up as being guilty of this, of we can sometimes congratulate ourselves that look at all the things I've read and the great ideas I've collected in my mind. And we have to admit that there's some self-congratulation often involved in that, and very oftentimes political associations and ideology behind that kind of our own ethos around our own particular like canons of literature. This is my library of works that are valuable to me as an artist. And I think most people would be a little bit dishonest if they claimed that it was only the intellectual ideas there that were part of their unique personal canon and nothing else at play. So in terms of the politics and ethics of the writers and the work and the writer in their own unique library. So that question to me is the really more challenging one of what is my relationship to this work and this author? And if I find myself in either case, I think it's either choice is a very interesting one to me and very, very weighted. The choice to keep a, let's just say, problematic author in my own personal canon of literature that's important to me, or the choice to expel it. It's like this idea of curation. We are each the curators of our own libraries, and we write the rules in terms of what belongs in our personal archive and what doesn't. And curating and archiving always has a political apparatus attached to it. There's always a political ethos behind that, impulse to archive, to curate, whether it's what we're including or what we're excluding. And we have to look at the extreme examples, which are sometimes easier to form an opinion on, the Nazis promoting Aryan literature and burning books by Jews, a famous example. That's an extreme example, but that's very connected to what we're talking about. Where do we draw the line of what we want to curate and accept into our canon, and what do we expel, and on what basis do we expel works and their authors out of our personal library? So I mean, so much.
Well, I think you actually touched on this for me a little bit, and it's a question that that I'm curious about. What do each of you feel is actually at the heart of this debate? Because when we say, well, can we separate the art from the artist? That means different things to each of us. I feel like ML touched on this a little bit, that sometimes when we're discussing, controversial topics like this, sometimes we're not even really discussing the heart, of the same matter. So I'm curious to hear from each of you, what do you feel is at the heart of this debate? For me personally, to me, the heart of this is the ethics of redemption, and can we ethically consume under late stage capitalism? But that's my own personal opinion. So I'm curious to hear from each of you. I think I'd like to start with Moni on this one, because I'm curious to see what's going on in her mind.
I echo what you say. Yes, I would have the same question. And ML, like the true question that you're pointing at, to me, that is a very pertinent one as well. In addition to that, I wonder about our personal attachment, whether it's an emotional attachment to work, whether it's some kind of intellectual attachment, how that can either create a barrier for us to expel, or if it strengthens the bond and those inroads that we keep allowing that author to kind of, or artist to occupy space in our realm. So to me, yeah, I would add that on. How do we factor in our attachment to work? That's all for me for now.
Would you like to jump in next, Richard?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I keep wondering, I mean, we're approaching this in terms of people who do bad things. They make good art, but they're bad people. What do we do with it? But if I reverse it in my mind, I think, well, what if somebody writes a book that I consider to be a bad book, but it does a heroic thing? Right? Suppose there's a good person writing a bad book. Um, does that make the book better? Right? You know, I don't think it does. I've never seen that happen where somebody goes, oh yeah, this was a terrible. Oh, but look, they you know saved a dog from a burning building. Right? You don't. It doesn't change our aesthetic and emotional reaction to their work. We might be sad that they're not as good as a writer as they are a person, but it doesn't change the definition of the work. So right now it's, you know, we're phrasing it in terms of one moral problem, a moral problem and then literary problem, the quality of the work and the quality of the person. And it's very easy to look at it only in that way. The second thing is that, you know, not only do, if you look at the New York Times bestseller list, where you find, you know, books by, you know, sort of people we wouldn't agree with, Republicans, you know, putting out their memoirs or putting out their political statements, and they're suddenly shooting to the top of the bestseller list because other Republicans and other Republican donors are simply buying the books and warehousing them. So you get 500 books bought by one person at a time in order to use the weight, you know, the fact that a book is a product in a capitalist world where the number of consumers who take it or the amount of money it makes has a value. Now that's independent of the value of the work, but it's not independent of the value of the economic effect of the work. So you get all sorts of these biases going on. And again, it's easy to see, well, I bought this book by J.D. Vance because he's the vice president nominee for the Republican Party and I love Trump. I said all that, but I don't believe a word of it. So if that's recorded, don't excerpt that. Uh, no. Well, that's clearly wrong when we're talking about the value of the work. So I think I guess the question is I'm not sure what the question is. I think part of it's fairness to the object. Do we owe anything to an object? Do we owe anything to a work of art that it has a being or it has it is an entity on its own that deserves, it's asking for us to have a relationship with it. And if we absent the author, as we look at older things we don't know anything about the creator, we can then have that. We can then have that relationship. So I guess at the heart of the question is the relationship to the work itself, which I think there is such a thing as the work itself. And I know, yeah, I'm going to leave it there.
Well,
Thank you, Richard.
I'll jump in and first point out, I believe J.D. Vance was on the bestseller list way back when he still proclaimed to hate Trump. So that's worth noting.
That is true.
I would also point out, you raise an interesting question, which makes me think of just the incredibly commercial literary landscape that we live in. And I think you could say it's never been less possible to be an anonymous author, like to literally get published without folks knowing something about who you are. And obviously it's the idea is much more prevalent in certain genres than others. In other words, I've heard tell, I don't know from firsthand knowledge because I'm not a novelist or a nonfiction writer, but I have heard tell that it's getting darn near impossible to get a book deal in nonfiction, and maybe to some degree in other genres too, if you haven't met a threshold of having, let's say, 1 million followers on one of these social media sites. So in a very real sense, the literary landscape itself is not so much allowing for this idea of literary works to stand on their own without being attached to a very, very visible and discernible and legible identity. A person who already has a well-defined connection to one part of the world. Maybe it's MAGA people, maybe it's people of a certain identity who have had a certain kind of experience, like sexual survivors, or maybe it's a celebrity. Unfortunately, I think that the nature of the publishing world at the moment is such that those two things are inextricably tied. So it does make sense for us, when we stumble upon a troubled past of an author, to take a literary figure down in the same way that they were hoisted up, which is in that realm of social media and commerce and all of that part of it. But I'm also struck by something you said, Richard, and think about my own work, because my main translation project, currently a book that's coming out next spring, I in fact am translating an anonymous poet. So again, translation is a slightly different set of problems and configuration. But although she is an anonymous poet, and we don't have a name for her, we don't even know exactly which century she was born in or when she lived, sometime between 600 and 1000 AD. Other things about her experience, I think, are very relevant to the reading that I bring to bear on this poem. And one could very easily accuse me of that terrible crime of committing authorial, intent, seeking authorial intent, or connecting an identity. In this case, someone that we can't know exactly who this person was, but we can deduce, I think, from many things in the text itself, what her life was like, what the life experience was like of the person who wrote this poem that creates such a stark heart's cry against and lament for the brutal patriarchal circumstances of the time. The poem circles around themes of sexual assault and violence and perhaps spousal abuse, all kinds of provocative issues. And I think in this case, it is very relevant to, although we should be mindful of what we can and cannot know about this person behind this text, I think it is very relevant to, in my case, to the task of translating the work and bringing it into our century and our modern English, to reverse engineer what this person's life would have been like, that lived the experiences that led them to write this poem. An amazingly experimental and radical poem of its time, in compared to the other things that were being written, like Beowulf. It's an extremely marginal perspective, and I think in that way, and we can probably imagine lots of other examples of cases where it's terribly relevant who the person is, the persona behind the work, even while it is nonetheless still important to some degree judge the merits of a literary work, let's say, on its own terms. And I'm also drawn to something that you brought up, Moni, about this issue of attachment. And I think there's ways in which we of course we're attached to the things we've read, like you said, Melvi, having an early relationship with an author like Bukowski. there's a way in which we can't like unbreak the egg, like that if that and it's different writers for different people, but there's a way in which in your formative years a writer is so entwined with your ideas about what it means to be an author, and really opens up your mind to what literature can do. You can't undo that impact. So to a certain degree, it would be a little bit absurd to expel them, from our own mental sort of archive of, no, that person's work is no longer important to me. I don't know if would be so easy to do that, but
Yeah.
yeah, lots of really interesting questions intersecting.
Mhm.
Was there something that you wanted to jump in with, Richard? I saw your hand.
Yeah,
go up.
sorry.
No, it's
Yeah,
what we're here for.
yeah. I think, I mean, I think you're absolutely right, ML, where that we do. I mean, that example is great. And I read about that particular work on your bio. I'm really interested in seeing it. Foucault's answer to Barthes is that it's not about the real person author, but it's about what he calls the author function. That is, we cannot help but imagine the person who wrote what we're reading. And we do have a relationship with that person. What's happening right now, and I saw Ria put up a thing about where's Alice Munro in this story, because I mean, clearly that was the big topic, and I think Moni, you alluded to it. That I think is one of the motivators for this panel right now is what do we do? And I think to where we are now in this conversation, part of the problem, of course, the problem is what Alice Munro did, but the problem with what Alice Munro did was that it contradicts so thoroughly the Alice Munro, that the author function that we all engage in, and she did it as well. It's so contradictory to what we expected her to be, based on their work. And that's where we have this clash. We were attached to the work, and I've got a Globe and Mail article that came out as a eulogy to Alice after she died, and it's full of love, and it's full of love for her, and it's full of love for her, and then the qualities in the work that this writer connects with are about, I put my writing first, I put my family second. Like the characters in the work whom the reader reads as this, this overthrowing of patriarchal order that is supposed to lie in every woman's mind, right? My family before myself, etc. So she reads that, and then of course, when Alice Munro does what she does, putting in part her literary reputation, putting in part her own needs ahead of the needs of her child, then that's exactly the wrong thing. So we've got this really complicated knot of who she was, what she did, and who we projected, who we concluded she was based on what she'd written. Later writing has since gone back and found all the clues for what she really was in the work, but we didn't see it at the time. Now, that's not excluding her. And Andrea Skinner's articles and her interviews have all emphasized that she does not want her mother's work to be excluded or exiled because of what happened in her family. Like, I think Andrea's answer is very interesting because it says, no, don't exclude it. You may not be able to read it the same way again. Fair enough, but don't stop reading it, right? These sorts of things add this kind of complexity. And I found, hang on, there's Claire Dederer, critic. She wrote a book called Monsters, A Fan's Dilemma. And she argued that when you are confronted with the bad behavior, the horrible behavior, the reprehensible behavior of somebody who has written something that you loved, that it's a miniature, it's an arm's length experience of what happens to you if you find out that someone you love personally has done something terrible. What do you do with that? What do you do with the knot of feelings and the pushes and pulls when you find out that someone you really are, just not an author, but a person in your own life? And I think Deirdre Dieter is actually offering us a way to think about what's happening now as a result of where we got to in our culture with authors, with our own lives.
That's great. Thank you so much, Richard. And I mean, so many things are coming to mind as we go through this panel together, and something kind of jumped out at me. This kind of how Richard, flipped it for us a little bit of, well, what happens when the author who saved the puppy from the burning building writes a horrible book. And I also think, through the lens of there are artists that I would be very uncomfortable separating their art from who they were, because it's integral. I think of artists like Nina Simone and Frida Kahlo, who their identities are integral to their work, and it would almost feel unethical to separate those artists from their work. I think of my own work and my experiences as a mixed race, Black, neurodivergent woman who's queer. Those experiences inform my art, and I think I'd be kind of horrified if somebody kind of plucked all of those life experiences from the work that I produce. So I think there is a point of thinking of how those, particularly those of us from marginalized or underserved or equity seeking communities, how those identities can be integral to the work, and it might not be appropriate at all to separate those identities from the work. I do have a bit of a curious question for all of our panelists, because this came up in my preparation for the panel today, and I think of the art form as well, or the form of expression. So for myself, I didn't have any compunction about never listening to R. Kelly's music ever again, or Chris Brown. Once I heard they were trashy trash, they were complete write-offs for me. And I wonder, from all of the panelists here, if you feel that the art form or the form of expression informs our decision to attempt to separate the art from the artist, because I didn't think of that for myself until those kind of musician examples came up, and I thought, well, for me, I guess it does inform my decision, because it's much harder for me to throw out poets that have questionable pasts or present, but musicians, I find it a bit less ethically fraught to do so. So I'm curious from all the panelists if the art form informs, the decisions that you make around this question. Should I start with Moni or Richard?
Yeah, no, Moni's done.
No, I'm not going to go first this time, actually.
I'll go first.
I'm still thinking as well, yeah.
I like the question. It's interesting to think about. I don't know if there is a generic distinction in terms of different genres, different art forms for me, but I can point to an example for myself. When I learned about the Kevin Spacey controversy, I think I was in between seasons of the show that he was in the process of making, House of Cards, which was a show I really, really enjoyed. And when that scandal broke, I was just like, no, I cannot watch Kevin Spacey content anymore. So I think it it could be interesting to think about in terms of your question, Melvi, like thinking about how we receive creative content, like where in the body we receive it, and how that might influence our relationship to the work that has been tainted, you know, by a controversy or scandal like this in this way. For an actor whose medium is their own face and their own bodily presence, I think that may have had something to do with why I was just like, nope, I cannot watch this person on screen. For you, I'm wondering, Melvi, you know, if that had something to do with you, the fact that music you take in, if the way in which the body receives the content makes a difference in terms of how tolerable or intolerable it is to us. But I also just keep coming back to this idea that it's just so idiosyncratic, I think, to the individual. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think that's very sort of natural, you know, because we're bringing our own sort of experiences to not only the work, but to the facts that we learn about the creator behind the work. And I just don't think there's any getting around that fact, you know. I mean, it is, I think, bound to be different for different people. And I have so many examples in my life of people who have sworn off this one, but not that one, but this one, but not that one. You know, and the facts are different, and there's oftentimes a disparity in the severity of the crime or the, you know, the degree to which we can know beyond a reasonable doubt, the nature of the scandal, so on, etc. And I'm sure that plays into it too. But I think there is something fundamentally idiosyncratic about it, and that has to do, among other things, with the experiences that we always bring as a reader and as a listener to the works we perceive and intellectualize and make meaning from. We are participating in the meaning making. So if part of what we're bringing, part of the apparatus that we're bringing to that job of making meaning is in the background, you know, experiences that I've had that make it so that I can't, you know, see a movie with a depiction of violence in this way. It's just like, nope, that just hits me the wrong way, and I just cannot engage with it. That's a very, you know, readerly specific case by case basis. I think that there might not be any way of getting around, but I'm very interested in this idea of how we might have different opinions about different genres based on which part of our sensorium experiences the work. Is, I think, a really interesting idea.
So a few things come to mind for me. One is around, I think when I'm faced with this type of question, it takes me to a place of wondering what systems I'm feeding. So I feel like it is genres or art form specific for me. And tapping back into ML, your points around, you know, the capitalist structures. I think, okay, if it's a movie, is this something I want to feed with my time, attention, money, efforts, right? So there's a very, I think, deliberate action that I can take around that. And it also makes me pause and wonder often, because I find often the things I consume, and I imagine many of us consume, are trend driven. So, you know, we're pushed towards movies or plays or shows, books, because we've heard about them, right? Friends have recommended them, they're on top 10 lists, etc. So there's something pushing us towards that. And I often wonder, is that a moment for me to reconcile? Is this the only option? Is this the only way for this story to be told? Or can I widen the landscape of choices in this situation? So if it's, you know, Kevin Spacey, House of Cards, I remember that was very popular, and I remember always feeling that I was missing out because I hadn't watched it yet. And I was like, oh, I got to put that on my list. I got to make time for that. But now I'm like, well, wait, maybe there's fantastic other shows that people aren't talking about, and I need to take a step back from what we're being fed in maybe diversify and look to other types of storytelling and other types of art. So that I think presents another opportunity. And finally, I would say for me, it's about holding multiple perspectives. So at the end of the day, if I want to continue consuming that art and appreciating that art, buying it, whatever actions I'm taking it, at the same time, am I willing to hold multiple perspectives in that I appreciate the art, but I may not like the artist? And if I can reconcile those two things, then I would continue on that path. And if not, then I would, yeah, readjust and course correct.
I think it sounds like we're all going to be in agreement here on some level about what we're saying. I mean, I think I agree with the way you phrased it, ML, that that it is idiosyncratic. You know, it is. You know, there are things that I don't want to see or don't want to hear, or don't want to watch anymore, and there are things that I continue to. The list every time somebody becomes um, becomes the object of the wrath of the readers or the viewers, someone else will go, well, look at all these people that you've forgiven. They do the same thing. Why? Why is that happening? And then, you know, I mean, it's because the author in the work also represents something so that, you know, you can see, well, you can see the immense, a large amount of support that's been given to very bad actors because they are seen to represent something that the people who support them want to keep up in the forefront. I really wish everyone could just go with that and say, okay, it's idiosyncratic, but there is a huge social value here, you know, which is, I think, part of the fuel of the reason or the need to talk about it, in that, you know, Alice Munro's books get taken out of courses. They get, you know, the honors in her name, chairs in her name, etc., become revoked. You know, we actually don't just leave it to our own selves to decide whether you want to buy that book or own that book or hit that website. You know, there's all sorts of social opprobrium. There's all sorts of power in play here about the nature of our own, what I think ideally would be our own decision to make. So you know, the word weaponized got used a little while ago. And I mean, it seems like, okay, this isn't very popular. So or this was, you know, we can make this popular. We can make House of Cards very popular. And I imagine it was a very popular show, 5 seasons or something like that. But then, you know, then Kevin Spacey became the object of scandal and he had to withdraw. He was asked to leave the show. But people didn't watch the next season. Like, the season didn't work without him. The show didn't work without him. They tried, which is interesting. But it wasn't like they gave all the viewers the option. They just got rid of him, right, from the cast. So it's, how do I reconcile the fact that I believe, and I think we all do, that it's a personal choice, but it's a personal choice with very widespread social consequence, and we're pushed by widespread social forces. The other thing, you've talked about the internet. I think ML, you said you can't get a nonfiction book published without having 1 million followers, you know, online. Something.
So I've heard. I'm a poet and translator, so it's
Yeah, no,
it's no bother to me.
It's not a concern in our particular business, but it is a concern, right? And the internet, I think, started as this idea that you were speaking about, Moni. There's all these options. I mean, if you don't like one website, there are millions more. Yet, the same pattern of viewership that we think of as being purely the result of some force like a capitalist force or a state-run force, state-sponsored forces that create, you know, the heroes and the villains of literature, is happening on the internet. You know, there are, you know, 10 influencers or 10 YouTubers. Oh, I'm old. There are 10, you know, 10 content creators. Oh, that's it. There are 10 content creators who are viewed by something like 10% or 20% of the audience. Well, that's an enormously small number of people getting an enormously large amount of attention. No prompting at all that I can see, except this is what readers do. This is what viewers do, is they pick their favorites and they share who their favorites are, and other people pick their favorite. It seems to be something, I mean, I know it's economic, but there's a certain anthropological thing that I'm seeing happen, or I'm thinking about happening, when I look at that same pattern of consumption, right? And you know, being paid attention to and being ignored, that we see in all the other times we've produced anything for other people to view or read or hear.
That's great. Thank you so much, Richard. There was one point, as I know we are running very, not starting to, we are running short on time. There's a point that that Moni brought up that I didn't want to lose that thread, because I think it's a question that kind of hit me in my gut, is, you know, whose work are we, you know, choosing to support, and what systems are we, you know, investing in? Because there is something to be said for, you know, with the Charles Bukowskis and Louis C.K.'s and Chris Browns of the world, you know, which poets, which musicians, which dancers am I not experiencing, am I not investing in their work when I'm, you know, defending some ding dong? You know what I mean? Like, there is this greater question of, you know, when we do have this knowledge of, you know, misgivings or you know, criminal activity or evil deeds from some of our you know, our favorite or most cherished, you know, authors and artists, maybe we can consider that also as an opportunity to start investing in some lesser known artists who maybe have been victimized by, or people like them have been victimized by, these, you know, popular and well-regarded artists. And so there is that question. I think it's very close to my heart as well, of, you know, when we're investing in one, you know, author, poet, or artist, you know, we do take our attention, our time, and our money away from others. And I think that is a thread to kind of keep in our minds. There's so many things to, you know, say and continue on. I did put a question in the chat. Whenever I facilitate a workshop, sometimes I give out life work, never homework. It's just a question that I posed in the chat, for anyone who wants to consider it more deeply. It is 1:01. I do want to be respectful of everyone's time. There's a question from Catherine. They've been so patient the last 10 minutes. So if you're able to indulge and stick around so we can hear Catherine's question, I would really appreciate that, of folks. So Catherine, feel free to unmute yourself and ask away. If she's still there. Sometimes the hand up is an accident, but I didn't want to miss, in case. That's totally fine, Catherine. We just wanted to make sure we didn't miss your question. So it is 1:02. I feel like I would love to have like a proper question and answer period, but I don't want to keep folks back. But I know myself, and I believe Ashley, who has been our wizard behind the scenes, will be sticking around for a few minutes. I do want to take this this time and opportunity to thank our wonderful panelists today, Moni, Richard, M, and ML. All of their insights have been undoubtedly mind expanding, and I encourage all of us to think more deeply about what all of our panelists have shared today. I want to send a big thank you to the Writers Guild of Alberta for hosting this controversy at noon panel discussions. This has been just incredible, and also to the Rosé Foundation for their support, and also, of course, to all of our wonderful guests who are here and joining from wherever you're joining today. We would just be talking to ourselves, which admittedly, given the room, wouldn't be so bad, but I do appreciate all of you for being here today.